Hi everyone, in this video I want to talk a little bit about the number 27. I actually have a lot of other things that I want to talk about, but I just want to talk about this first because I've had the tabs up on my computer for a few days now. It actually came up in a comment and it was something I had been looking at the time, and so that's why I mentioned it in the comment. And so I just want to go ahead and talk about that before I clear out all of these tabs, and then I can get back to some of the other things that I've been wanting to talk about. But I've already talked about the importance of the number 27 and how it's connected with the prophecy in the book of Daniel. It's in Daniel 9:27, where the Messiah, the Prince, confirms the covenant. And I've explained before how all the years alternate between the numbers 77 and 27 for the Jubilee years. And I've explained before how the year of creation begins with -222. This is actually the last piece of the puzzle, or the last piece of the timeline that I added when I watched a video by Pastor Sandy Armstrong. As I've explained before, the timeline originally began with the date of the Exodus, which was exactly 70 weeks or 70 Jubilees, and that year was 2277, which is like the number 27 amplified, and that's how the timeline began until I saw the video by Pastor Sandy Armstrong, when I converted the date that he came up with to the date on the Hebrew calendar. It came out to -222, and as you can see, that makes a perfect 27 in triplicate, with the 3 2s and the 3 7s beginning and ending the timeline, and then all the years in between for the Jubilees alternate between the numbers 77 and 27. Okay, and so another thing that I've talked about before is how these numbers and the timeline also correlates with the measurements of the Great Pyramid of Giza, and how the numbers are connected to the Great Pyramid of Giza, which is something I want to talk a little bit more about in this video. But I mentioned before that right in the middle, if you look at the measurement of the volume, right in the middle of that, you have the numbers 2277, which is the year of the Exodus, and then it ends with 778, which is the current Hebrew year. It begins with 91 million, which 91 is 19 backwards, and the prophecy just so happens to be mentioned in Isaiah 19:19. This is where it says, "In that day shall there be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar at the border thereof to the Lord." And I can talk a little bit more about this prophecy later, but I've explained before how I believe this number represents DNA, and I talked about how I believe the word pillar represents DNA. It's also a word that Pastor Sandy Armstrong has talked about, that the value for this word in the Hebrew is 120, and it correlates with the word church in the Greek, because you just add a 0 to get the New Testament meaning of it, which would be 1200, and the value for 1200 in the Greek is the word church. So the pillar represents the church, but I've also talked about how I believe it represents DNA, and that it also represents Christ. And this is something that Pastor Sandy Armstrong mentioned as well, that the pillar that the Israelites were guided by, the pillar by day and the fire, I believe, by night, was a representation of Christ. So the pillar also represents Christ, but more importantly, it represents his DNA. I've also mentioned before that the numbers 9 and 1 are a way of representing the Alpha and the Omega, or the first and the last, because 1 is the first number on the timeline and 9 is the last single-digit number. So the numbers 1 and 9 represent the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, or the last and the first, which is Jesus, or God, of course, and 9 is also the number for judgment. Okay, so what I noticed some time ago is that it's in Exodus 3:14 where God said to Moses that his name is I am that I am. And I mentioned before how God's name is a representation of DNA. If you look at this in the Strong's, you see that it comes from the word Haya. You see the word Haya twice. It's a way of saying God's name, and you see the 9 and the 6, which represent DNA. It's like right side up and upside down, and it means to become or to be. And so God is basically magnifying that by saying it twice and saying that his name is I am that I am, and then that itself represents DNA because it's a two-part word and it's symmetrical, just like the name Haya is symmetrical. You see the H-A-Y-A-H, so it's exactly symmetrical. Okay, and so I just noticed that it just so happens to be recorded in Exodus 3:14, which is a number for pi. Okay, and pi is what's used for measuring the circumference of a circle. So it represents a circle, and in Pastor Sandy Armstrong's latest videos, he's been talking about Ezekiel's wheel and how everything goes full circle. And so the circle is something that represents eternity as well, because a circle, you can keep going around and around in a circle, it never ends, so it's a way of representing eternity. Okay, another thing that represents eternity is the golden ratio, or phi. Okay, and I'll just show you an image of that. It's the same thing as the Fibonacci sequence, but as you can see, the line can just keep going and going for eternity. And the numbers pi and phi are irrational numbers. That means the ratio does not develop a pattern. It just keeps going. It never ends, and it just keeps going. Okay, it says here an irrational number is a number that cannot be written as a simple fraction. And so two of the most famous irrational numbers are pi and phi, but as you can see, they just keep going. The digits never end, and they never develop a pattern. Okay, so I've talked about how if you take the base of the pyramid or if you take the height of the pyramid and you divide it by half the base, you come up with a ratio from which you can get the ratio of the slope, which is the golden ratio. Okay, and the way you do that with the Earth is if you take the height, which is 5040, which is actually the Earth and the Moon combined, is what gives you the height. And then if you divide it by half the diameter, you get 1.27 infinitely. And this is the same as with the Great Pyramid of Giza. If you take the height, which is 280 cubits, and you divide it by half the base, which is 440 cubits, so that would be 220 cubits, you get the same number. You get 1.27 infinitely. So you have the same ratio that determines the slope, which is the golden ratio. You can see that here, it's 1.618. You have to inverse tan that ratio to get the slope. And so there's a direct relationship between the Great Pyramid of Giza and the Earth and the Moon. And there's also the same relationship with New Jerusalem, because when you measure New Jerusalem in feet, it's 7,920,000 feet, and this relates to the Great Pyramid of Giza, but it also relates to the diameter of the Earth because it's 7,920 miles. So there's a direct relationship with the Earth, the Great Pyramid of Giza, and New Jerusalem. So what I was trying to do is I was trying to find the ratio of New Jerusalem, and I'll explain that in a minute. But first I just want to say another calculation that comes up to 1.27 is the square root of phi, as you can see here. And so I just thought I would try that out. Okay, as you can see here, I just put in square root of phi, and you can see it comes out to 1.272. It's not 1.27 infinitely, but it's 1.272. And so then I tried the square root of pi, and that comes out to 1.77. So the square root of phi is 1.27, and the square root of pi is 1.77. Okay, so remember these Jubilee years alternate between the numbers 77 and 27. And so the square root of pi is 1.77. The square root of phi is 1.27. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to try for myself is to try to calculate the ratio of New Jerusalem to see how that would come out, see if it comes out to 1.27. Okay, so the problem was that the base of the temple is measured in furlongs, but there's also a measurement for the wall, which I believe needs to be added, because I believe that would correlate with the moon being added to the earth, because the base of the temple is 12,000 furlongs, which is 7,920,000 feet, which correlates with the 7,920 miles of the earth. So there's a direct correlation with the earth, and so I believe the wall would have to correlate with the moon. Of course, I've mentioned before that the wall represents the bride, I believe, because it measures 144 cubits. So you have the number 144. And I've mentioned before how it's interesting that this comes up in Revelation 21, verse 17. So you have the measurement of the temple in verse 16, and then the wall, which represents the bride, in verse 17. But I believe together they make the temple. And so what I was trying to do is convert the cubits to furlongs. Okay, so the first thing I noticed is that there's a huge difference between cubits and furlongs. So if you put in 12,000 furlongs, you can see that it takes 5,280,000 cubits to make 12,000 furlongs. So there's a huge difference between cubits and furlongs. Okay, that sort of reminds me of the difference between the Yod and the Lamed in the word Israel that I talked about in my last video. But the other thing that I noticed is if you go back to cubits, you see that it starts out with 0.023. Of course, 23 is a number having to do with DNA. So if you put in 100 cubits, that's 0.23 furlongs. But then I also noticed that you have this pattern over here with the number 27. So if you keep adding zeros, you see that it begins to alternate between the numbers, or it develops a number 27. Seems to be infinitely, but then it begins to change after a while. And so I'll just keep going until it changes, and then you see that it starts just making zeros. And so you have the number 24 backwards, which is how many chromosomes Jesus had. And then up until you get to that point, you just have a sequence of the number 27, but it starts out with 227. If you look at the Strong's number 227 in the Greek, it means true or truth, or loving the truth. But what's really interesting is if you look at the number 2277 in the Greek, it means to be, and it comes from the word emi, which means I am, which is basically God's name in the Greek. And so this is a form of the word I am. And this is the number that's right in the middle of the Great Pyramid of Giza. And it's also the year of the Exodus on the Hebrew calendar, and the Strong's in the Hebrew means everything Hebrew.